Patrick N. Hunt is an archaeologist, historian, and biographer who has taught humanities, archaeology, and mythology at Stanford University since 1993. A fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in London, Hunt has been featured on TV documentaries, including National Geographic Explorer, Nova, and the Discovery Channel. He is also a National Geographic expeditions expert. Articles about his Hannibal research have appeared in National Geographic, Archaeology Magazine, and Earth Magazine, among others. He is the author of 10 Discoveries That Rewrote History, which he was here a few years ago to talk about. And also, When Empires Clash, 12 Great Battles in Antiquity, among other books. So he's here tonight to talk about Hannibal. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Hunt.
Thank you, Paul, and it's a pleasure to be here again. Now, before I forget, it's important, since you see Stanford plastered all over here, to remember that I'm a Cal Berkeley alumnus. Is that okay? So, no, it's not okay to some. Well, I can tell you that I am equally with a foot on both sides of the bay. And you have to stretch to do that. And it's a big game that's a bit challenging. But I think it was at Berkeley where I actually learned what hard work was. And now I'm working hard at Stanford. So 25 years at Stanford. It's been a good ride. And I've taken, in those 25 years, probably 300 Stanford students across the Alps, across from Spain, from Carthage, down over the Alps into Italy, through the battle sites. And one of the wonderful things about being able to teach is that you're with kids who are a lot smarter than you are. And you connect all those brains together. And of course, we've had students from all across the country. And in fact, many international students as well. So it's not just students who have come from the farm, or what sometimes is called by others the junior university. That's what Cal says. But it's okay, because Stanford is such a wonderful place to be. And I don't have any problem with my allegiance now being there. In fact, it's an interesting point that there are many, many Cal Berkeley alumni teaching at Stanford, but it doesn't seem to always go the other way. But then Stanford's a smaller school. But it is a privilege to be here, and I will say that Hannibal, believe it or not, when people say, well, are you talking about Hannibal Lecter? Hannibal the cannibal? And I say, no, but there's a connection. There is indeed a connection. If you're a scholar and you read Polybius and all the other sources in antiquity, you realize that Hannibal had a lieutenant whose name was also Hannibal, because it's not an uncommon name in the Punic culture. And Hannibal lieutenant said to Hannibal Barca, the commander, when they got to the top of the Alps, and suffered so much loss from ambush, from the weather, hypoxia, hypothermia, precipices. There were so many deaths on Hannibal's army. Some say 40%. Wow. With all those bodies lying around, Hannibal, the lieutenant, said to Hannibal, the commander, fresh meat, what do you think? We're starving, we have no food, the Celts have ambushed us, our pack animals are gone. That's meat. And Hannibal actually said, on the record, I don't think so. But you see, now you know a very esoteric point that almost nobody knows, that there's a connection between Hannibal Barca and Hannibal Lecter. There you are, a little bit of trivia. Now, very often, I find in the Bay Area, I don't have so many of my students who come with me across the Alps or down to Italy, but with National Geographic funding, I am so fortunate. Maybe you're members of the National Geographic Society. If you are, you've helped fund our research. We have been to every battle site, as I said, starting from Carthage, going all the way to all the places Hannibal lived, including all the way to his final days in Labissa, Turkey, in the Sea of Marmara. So I'm very, very fortunate to be able to have that kind of funding. And I also believe, like Polybius, the primary source historian, it's important to have your feet on the ground. I could never be an armchair historian. I have to be there. And it's amazing when you're on these sites to understand the topography and the terrain, which was really important to Hannibal. And I'll explore a little bit of that tonight, why that was sort of his secret weapon. And I've been very fortunate, too, with the book, because my editor is the vice president, Simon Schuster. And that really helps. You can only imagine. And these days, as I was starting to sort of hint earlier, a Guardian reporter called me, the lead reporter, senior reporter from the Guardian, called me up 3 weeks ago and wanted to interview me over the telephone about my biggest Hannibal scoops that appear in the book. And I started off with sort of a low-level one, and I shared it. She said, "That's great, but give me something better." And I said, "Okay, here's a higher level." She said, "Oh, that's really fantastic, but I need something that's really going to grab everybody's attention." And I gave her a National Geographic proprietary scoop that only Stanford knows about at the moment. And she said, "That's wonderful." But she said a year ago that would have been front page news. A year ago, front page news. What has made the difference? Well, do I need to say it? No, I don't need to say it. We have a news cycle dominated by other things. And understandably, I'm encountering this quite frequently, and yet there is a connection too. Hannibal's always relevant. Hannibal's strategy and tactics are taught at every military institution almost in the world. I've been to many of them in France, Britain, here. I lecture regularly at the U.S. Naval War College, and I have a room full of officers and analysts from agencies that will not be named, and they're keen to know Hannibal's tactics. So there's always political relevance. And Hannibal would have absolutely obliterated many modern commanders, especially impetuous ones who are sort of wannabe commander-in-chiefs, who may not do their homework, and I'm not going to, again, go into detail. But seriously, Hannibal was a force to be reckoned with in the ancient world, and still is today. You're all aware that General Patton, George Patton, was a huge fan of Hannibal, as was George Rommel in North Africa. In fact, the very term blitzkrieg, in the German sense, derives from Hannibal's lightning-quick movements in German, not the least because his last name was Lightning, Barca. And not just Schwarzkopf and Patton. Napoleon was a huge fan of Hannibal. So was Charlemagne. So was the Byzantine general Belisarius, who really made a lot of things happen for Justinian. Now, intriguingly, Napoleon tried so hard to guarantee that he had been where Hannibal was that he went over 6 alpine passes with armies to be able to say he had followed in Hannibal's footsteps. There's a very famous engraving that shows a Bonapartiste with a saber carving the names in a rock that previously sort of weathered, had Annibale, and then it had Carlo Magno, and now we're saying Bonaparte. So every person in history who's imagined him or herself to be a tactically brilliant commander has studied Hannibal. And so it's humbling for me to tell you that I'm sort of maybe one of the last, most recent, because there's probably a book about Hannibal every few years. There'll be 2 this year at least. And I can tell you 300 books since antiquity have been written about Hannibal. So why another one? Why? Well, partly because as an archaeologist and as a historian who believes that I have to be there, it's a little unusual because there aren't that many historians who've actually tracked Hannibal from venue to venue, from battle site to battle site, from campground to campground, from home to final home. And the point about secret weapon, his use, because he always had a smaller army, his use of the environment, the terrain, the topography, the weather, was unique. He broke prior battle precedents, and I believe this needs to be shared more. So I'm going to be going into a fair bit of detail on that tonight. These are, as I said, scoops from the book. But you can just see from this morass of words here, with a coin, by the way, that's probably from the Magove Ord in Spain. It may show Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, but the elephant is intriguing. And I work now for National Geographic as well as Stanford. It's really heady to be able to be, as I said, at Stanford, because it's intimidating to be around so many bright students. It's really, really intimidating, especially for those of you Stanford alumni here, you know what that's like, to be among the brightest. And then also, it's humbling because I've been working on this for 20 years of field research. And every year, we may find out new information, but there's still so much mystery to the enigma of Hannibal. There's still so much that remains to be seen. And when some of us speculate or add maybe new information, details, that mountain of data builds. Will we ever have enough? Will we ever be able to prove, for example, which pass Hannibal crossed? I think we've got some pretty good evidence. And I'm going to go into some of those details. Maybe, Paul, we can shut down a little bit of the light so you can see, since these are National Geographic photos, many of them. And there, is that better? And that was from just last year, if you know the Gornergratsch. Literally, these are the kinds of conditions Hannibal often had to go through in the Alps. Although he was only in the Alps for a total of maybe 10 days. He stayed in the valleys until the final approaches to the summits. So that's critical. And the altitudes to which his armies had to climb is mitigated by several factors, and I'll describe that a little bit. This is one of the National Geographic blurbs for an expedition, and in fact going in a week back to the Alps on leading another National Geographic expedition, doing this very same thing. Now, as I said, I've been very fortunate. Simon Schuster is just a dream publisher. Let's start real quickly, since some of you already know this, I won't go into too much detail. This map's a little misleading like all maps, because what shows purple as Punic or Carthaginian is actually low population density, and is also mostly allies and controlled by mercenaries. And you can see a very different type, two cultures clashing here, because the Carthaginians were mercantilists, they were trade-based, and the sea was really their domain. They weren't really interested in land. The Romans, however, were agronomists, they were farmers. They constantly needed more land, especially to expand, and you can see Italy as a peninsula surrounded by water, so they could only really expand north into Celtic and Etruscan territory. Those were barriers. And you probably already know that there are actually a lot of Celts living in the Po River Valley, what we call the Transalpine Celts, or Gauls. Remember, Gaul and Celt is the same word. Gaul is the Latin, Roman word. Celt is the Greek word. Herodotus uses Celtoi, Julius Caesar uses Gauls. But they're the same people. Think about it. If you say the sound g in your mouth, g, drop the vocal cords and what sound you get? G, Celt, Gaul, a T is added, but it's the same people. Or a masculine of many tribes. And naturally, they weren't very happy about Rome encroaching their territory. One tribe that lived right here, there's a tribe called the Bononi who lived right there in what's today Emilia-Romagna. The Bononia was their town. They called themselves the Boii. Today, that gives us the name Bologna. And their territory was being seized by Rome. 2 new colonies, 3 in fact, in the previous generation. Ariminum, which is right here, which is today Rimini. And then, of course, Piacenza, Placentia back then, and Cremona. Those were 3 new Roman colonies just carved out of Celtic farmlands and homelands. So the Celts called for help. Hannibal came as a liberator to the Celts. At least that was what he said. That was one of his main points. But when you look at the Carthaginian peoples, you have Numidians, Libyans, Getae, Mauritanians. And back then, the Sahara Desert was much smaller.
Yeah.
If you know, Rome still used Carthage as a breadbasket. Long afterward, all the cities that are on the coast, here, Sabrata, Leptis Magna, were well watered by rivers. They're all gone today, except in ruins. This was well watered, and the Sahara was smaller, and there was a lot more transcultural egress, traffic across North Africa. So, it was a melting pot. It was a multicultural group of people, including some with African DNA, not just modern Berbers or modern Arabs or the Maghreb. Now, with all these people, most of the armies of Carthage are mercenary. They're paid. And Rome, on the other hand, was primarily citizen militia, farmers who were conscripted. So, when you think about it, two very different philosophies. And many people think that Hannibal tried to destroy Rome, which is not the case. Hannibal's object was never to destroy Rome. It was to force Rome to let go of wanting Carthaginian domains, to relieve the pressure on Carthage. And of course, later, as some of you were saying, Cato stood up in the Senate, had a fig with him, ripe fig, and what was his mantra? Every speech he finished, they knew what to expect. Carthago delenda est. That's actually probably in a slightly different verb aspect and mood, but when he said this fig is fresh from 2 days away. That's how close Carthage was to what we'll call Campania, Naples. And that scared the Romans. And of course, that's why the First Punic War was over the stepping stone, because it's only 100 miles from Cape Bone to Cape Lilybaeum. Only 100 miles separate Carthage from Roman claims to Sicily. So too close for comfort. And Hamilcar, Hannibal's father, was in many wars between 264 to 241. The Romans were literally beaten many times. 1,000 ships, 100,000 soldiers were killed in the First Punic War, Roman soldiers. And yet it was only the last battle that Rome lost. Rome didn't give up. Carthage thought, we beat them so many times, they're just going to leave us alone. Not the case. Rome had that territorial manifest destiny of expansion. Hamilcar was stranded in 242 here near Erice in Sicily, and he came home reluctantly in 241 when the Gerusi, the Council of Elders, who ran the mercantile council in Carthage, said to him, oh, we've lost. And he said, you only lost one battle. And they said, but we've lost. Well, part of it was the Romans dredged up in all this war series a ship that was off the coast here, near what's today Trapani, but then Drepana, the islands, the Aegetis Islands, just off Sicily, where the last sea battle, 241, happened. The Romans dredged up, prior to this, a ship. And they took it apart. It was a ship from Carthage. They took it apart and they said, oh my. Every one of these Carthaginian ships is mass-produced. It's sort of like paint by numbers. On every piece of wood is an alphanumeric code. They just make these and put them together, assemble. So the Romans copied it. And then, of course, remember one of the aftermaths of all this is while Carthage had ruled the Western Mediterranean, once Rome downed that Carthaginian fleet in the last battle of the First Punic War in 241, what happened? They eventually renamed this as what? Mare Nostrum, which means what? Our sea, not their sea. It means ours. That's all part of the history, of course. But Hamilcar wasn't very welcome as a general back in Carthage. And the uneasy sort of truce between him as a charismatic general and the Carthaginian merchants was problematic also because he put down a mercenary rebellion. And then he said, well, Rome penalizes 10,000 talents of silver. That's a lot of money. I'm going to go to Spain to the Spanish silver mines. They didn't call it Spanish silver mines. I'm going to help mine a lot of silver to pay that back faster. Of course, his ulterior motive, when you think about ulterior motives, was probably to build up a war chest, which he did. And his young son, Hannibal, 9 years old, hadn't seen much of his father, said, "Dad, may I go with you?" And his father said, on one condition. Come to the altar at the temple of Baal, swear undying hatred to Rome on a living sacrificial victim. The temple of Baal. Why is that important? Because Hannibal's name is the favorite of Baal. Baal is his god. His life is dedicated to that god, despite what Livy says about Hannibal being irreligious. There are many times Hannibal took vows, later on too. Well, Hannibal was then raised in this place. Carthage, originally in the Phoenician colony of Tyre, had been called originally Carthage. And the god of cities, Cart, is Melkart, the king of cities, if you know you're Semitic, Melkart. And so Carthage, Hadash means new, the new. So Carthage, the original colony of Tyre in the 9th century, has its own colony called New. So it's like Carthage Tadash. And of course later becomes, in Latin, Carthago Nova, New Carthage. But Hannibal is raised here from 9 years old on. And you have to believe it, these are Celts. Now this river that we call today, the Ebro, was called the Iber then. So hence Iberia and Iberians. So a lot of these people were allies, but not that many Carthaginians. Now Carthage controlled most of Spain, even in the beginning of the Second Punic War, which is legitimately called the Hannibalic War. In fact, Carthage tried to keep responsibility at arm's length, claiming this was Hannibal's war. And they also said to Hannibal, now his father died, we think about 227 BCE. Some say in ambush where he tried to protect his 3 young boys and his family. And in that ambush, Hannibal's father was killed, and the armies of Carthage in Spain, many of them allies as well as mercenaries, proclaimed young Hannibal the successor to his father at 20 years of age. Raised by his father, taught military strategy, raised reading Alexander the Great and his exploits, having Greek tutors and so on. Hannibal was well educated, he knew his history, and of course, when Hamilcar went from Carthage in 237, he took along, they marched along the coast, they took across in ships at least 45 very young war elephants, not fully trained yet, baby elephants. And of course, Hannibal took at least 37 with him on his journey. But Rome drew a line literally in the sand and said, Hannibal, you can't cross the Iber River with arms. If you cross the Iber River with arms, that's a declaration of war, which you call a casus belli. And Hannibal did it. After basically taking down, Rome had 2 allies, Massilia, which was a Phocaean Greek colony, to supply wine, Greek wine to the Gauls or Celts, and that became a Roman ally. And then Saguntum was a Roman ally. Those were really the 2 main presences Rome had outside of Italy this far in the west. Well, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum, took 6 months, very difficult. If you've ever been to that hill, Sagunto, National Geographic sent me there, and we hiked all over it, and we could see all these terrace walls from thousands of years of fortresses at Saguntum, ancient Saguntum, which is, as I said, Sagunto. It took Hannibal 6 months to take down one small fortress, laying siege to it. And when he broke through the walls of this Roman ally, the Saguntine people, everybody was absolutely just shocked that the Saguntines had been cannibalizing their dead. They were starving. It starved them out. Rome was just disgusted and sent envoys to Carthage saying, this is wrong, you destroyed our ally, this is something now, we had settled this in the first war, you lost, you were under penalty, what are you going to do about this? And they said, Nothing, that's Hannibal. And then Hannibal assembled an army of 90,000, mostly mercenaries. As I said, Numidians, Getians, Libyans, Mauritanians, Carthaginians, Phoenician descendants too, of course. The Numidians were fantastic in their very mobile cavalry. But these came, and all the Celtiberians, variants, and he marched. He left 10,000 here on the south side of the Ebro River, 10,000 on the north side, 10,000 on the other side of the Pyrenees, and then 10,000 on the side of the, because he was protecting his rear, protecting his supply line. So he finally marched between 50 and 40,000 across the Rhone River. It's a very funny story how that happened, as Polybius says, but he even sent one of his generals up. Now, the Celts, some of the Celts, the Voconti, many of the tribes also opposed Hannibal. They didn't want an army going through their territory. They tried to stop him, some of them. Up here, the Allobroge tribe, where the Isère River runs into it, half of them split. The people in the rich farmlands said, yes, come on through, because Hannibal had silver to pay for food, of which they had surplus in the rich farmlands of France. But you get up into the Alps, no surplus. They had barely enough for themselves in those narrow valleys. And the other half, the Allobroges, opposed him. So we have all these names, and of course, Hannibal had a parley with the Celts who came over to say, just in today was basically Languedoc area. They came and met with him and said, please come help us. And he studied with them the route to go over the Alps because he planned to invade Italy. The Romans knew that Hannibal couldn't come by water, and if you've ever been to Nice or Monaco, if you've been to Monaco and you cross over to Genoa, along the Corniches, basically 120 tunnels because the Alps Maritimes plunging right into the sea. That's a steep coast. He couldn't come the coast route that the Romans blocked. He couldn't come by sea, so he really didn't have a whole lot of choice except to march north. The Romans found his embers of his campfire, said, where did he go? I guess he's coming back next year. They didn't know that he'd gone north up the Rhone River, the Scipioni clan tried to track him a little bit. The Massilians didn't quite know where he'd gone, but he went up the Rhone at basically 600 stades. A stade is 200 meters, so that's 120,000 meters. That's 120 kilometers. That's 80 miles. Polybius gives us this very discrete detail. And then he turned east at the Isara, this junction, which is the Isère River, as far as we can tell. And he wouldn't, as we'll see in a minute, he would come over and he got stalled quite a few times. He shouldn't be crossing the Alps in late October, early November, but he did. It's early winter there. If you've been in that area, as we have for years, the poplar trees lose their leaves in late August. It's already fall by late August. So by September, October, it's frosting in the mornings in those valleys. And by the time you get to the Alps, the snow is falling ragged and beginning to stick. So not probably the best thing to do, but Hannibal goes over. And of course, once he crosses in, he traps Publius Cornelius Scipio the Elder at the Ticinus River junction to Po. Were it not for a bridge, the Romans would have been massacred there. And he knocked out the Taurini tribe, currently Turin. And he had three so important battles over the next 2 or 3 years. The Trebia River, Trasimene, and Cannae. And I'm going to explain how that secret weapon was the environment. Because now, especially since he lost 40% of his army coming over the Alps, he had to augment his arsenal. Not just with Celts, not just with people who were in France and Italy, but he had to bolster his arsenal. And the way he did it was savvy use of the environment. I'll explain more of that. Now, the crossing of elephants. Polybius tells us that some points, because it's September when he crosses the Rhone, that the elephants were brought on rafts. They didn't like it. Of course, the males followed the females on these rafts with turf and grass. And then they were very unstable, and many of them jumped off. And if their feet could touch the water, river bottom, they put their basically their trunks up and snorkel over. Literally, he says their trunks came up above the water. So they snorkeled their way across. But of course, elephants can swim. People forget this. And elephants can also climb very high in Africa. They get up Mount Kenya, way above 10,000 feet. But of course, there it's still a tropical environment. So now, imagine the elephants. The Celts were so afraid of the elephants. Elephants have a very funky smell. Horses don't like them. Horses stampede. The Celts were very afraid of the elephants. They never attacked this train where the elephants were. But if you were a Celt, imagine what you might have thought. You've never seen these massive beasts before, sort of like the parallel of a tank in modern parlance. I think myself that to the Celts these look like giant boulders moving across the landscape. If you can imagine these strange beasts. Now, we could use humor here. One of my very good friends, John Hoyt and Richard Jolly, took an elephant over the Alps in 1959, tracking Hannibal. They eliminated many of the passes. They focused on one set of passes in the Central Alps. They borrowed an elephant from the Turin Zoo because it was an adolescent, and the zookeeper wanted to get rid of it for the summer. It was just way too rambunctious, a rambunctious young elephant. He said, please, please, take her. Well, Richard Jolly, John Hoyt took this elephant over the Alps, and the RSPCA in London got on their case so bad. What are you going to do? This poor elephant over the rocks. So they had massive leather boots made for these elephants. Those boots still exist. Massive, huge, thick leather boots. The elephant, whose name was Jumbo, and by the way, Richard Halliburton, another explorer, 1935, took an elephant over the Grand San Bernard Pass. Named Jumbo. Now the intriguing thing is, at least one person in the room has been with me over the Alps on several occasions. I will tell you that one of the things that got me so intrigued 25 years ago, every single village I was in at the top of the Alps, be it Switzerland, France, Italy, Austria, every village said, Hannibal came through here. I knew that couldn't be the case. So which one? That was part of the process of elimination. But the elephant that Richard and John took, Jumbo, this cute adolescent elephant, she was so smart, and she was an Asian elephant, but so smart, when they sang with the guitars Kumbaya at the campfire, she droned in. Literally, she sang along in an elephant drone. Very smart elephant. Well, we'll talk about elephants because that's an important question. Now, think of kids and piercings, right? Here's a war elephant with a little piercing. Thank you, New Yorker. But which Alps path did Hannibal take? It is still so contentious. Believe it or not, I have people who will not talk to me because we happen to disagree over one tiny little issue, which pass. And they've spent decades looking at one pass or two or three. Well, our teams have gone over 30 passes. And we feel like we can eliminate quite a few. But it's so contentious. Frank Walbank, the great Polybius historian, said in 1956, he said, more ink has been wasted on this than anything else in the conundrums of the classical past. But I'm not going to waste a lot of ink on it. In fact, my editor and I agreed we'd only put in one chapter. Because it was only totally a fortnight out of Hannibal's whole life. But it's still important. And here are just some of the passes we've gone through. We've gone over 30 of these passes. Let me just go back to that. Over 30 of these passes, some we go through every year. And he couldn't come this way, either the coast or the water. And think about it. Hannibal's god, Baal, or Baal. I personally wonder if Hannibal had a predisposition to going over these mountains in early winter because his god is the storm god and mountain god. Baal, god of storms and mountains. Maybe. Well, in any case, Hannibal wouldn't have come over the tops of the ridges. He would have followed the river valleys, the deeper river valleys. And here's where the Isère runs into the Rhone. This is where the Allobroge tribe lived. Hannibal had to engage with the Allobroge, so he's not going to cross down here. He has to cross where the Allobroge are. And it's 80 miles from Avignon to Valence, exactly as Polybius says. So I think you can suss out a lot of this. The rich farmland of the lower Allobroge tribe, but the mountains of the higher Allobroge tribe, where they have no surplus, and they're going to try to stop Hannibal. He's ambushed twice. We believe he's ambushed right here at Vorep, right there, and we believe he's ambushed right here at Bromont. The second ambush took place, and in the Greek it's Leucopetra, white rock place. And there's a massive geological anticline right there, and Polybius says the second ambush was 1 day's march from the summit. There's a perfect, huge white arc with green forest around it of dolomite and gypsum. It's just massively visible for miles. White rock place. And as I said, it's exactly 1 day's march from the summit. So I think you could piece a lot of this together. There are at least 10 criteria, and those of you who do number crunching, and that's probably Livermore is so famous for number crunching, with all the engineers and the labs here, if you think about it, the probabilities of one pass satisfying 10 criteria compounds as you get to those last 5 or so. Very difficult for one pass to satisfy those criteria in Polybius. But then, I only know 2 or 3 people in the world. 2 of them are Richard Jolly and John Hoyt, who've gone over almost as many passes as we have. Most people do not. All right, so now, which kind of elephants did he take? Well, question, yes.
Are there any archaeological remains?
Wouldn't that be nice? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. That's a critical question. Think of it. He's at the summit 2 days. 2 days only. And if you die up there in those conditions, what's going to happen to you? Well, all your buddies are going to strip you clean. Every bit of cloth, leather, metal, anything you've got, they're basically, you can't bury because of bedrock. They may pile some rocks on you, but they're going to strip you clean. They're going to say, thanks, you don't need it anymore. So artifacts, that's a low yield there. He's only there 2 days. Plus, on top of that, the Celts come after as scavengers and marauders, and after that, some of you know this from experience, when we've excavated in high altitude here, where there are bodies, the wolves come and they pull off their arms and legs, and we've had huge canine wolf bites in arm bones, because the wolves come for the meat and the marrow. So, what are the likelihoods of a lot of artifacts in a 2-day summit camp? Not very high. I'll talk about that. Now, okay, elephants in the Alps. What do you think? Sorry, Babar, elephants don't ski. Way too top heavy, center of gravity's too high, but you've got to watch out. If they fall, they roll. So snowball effect. I know you have some questions. Yes, please.
I wanted to know if you're going to speak about your theories or your companions' theories about the past.
I'm going to get to it. You'll see. Yep. Let me just back up. We believe the most logical route is to go up to the junction of the Isarian Road into Allobroge territory. There's a perfect Celtic oppidum, a hill fort, right there called Voreth, and it's the gateway to the Alps. And we've calculated it. And by the way, we have done this entire route, not just on foot, but also by bicycle and by vehicle. We don't do it all at once, we break it up. In 25 years, you only have to do a couple hundred kilometers in a week. So different teams over 25 years, we've cycled the entire route right to the summit. Now, with that then, if the Allobroge have to be found up here, and the first ambush is here, the second ambush is here, it's exactly 9 days from there to there by March. And the summit is right there, and that White Rock place is right there. So I think we can identify what we think is like that. Let's move on. Now, all right, so elephants, which kind? I remember my kids love Babar. Didn't your kids and your grandkids now? But elephants aren't necessarily conducive to Alps. And yet, it's not impossible. In fact, some of you know a book, The Elephant Company, Burmese Asian elephants can climb cliffs on a very narrow path, as was proven in World War II on many successive occasions. But going back to elephants, here, the boots of John Hoyt, the second pair of feet. Now, the two main type of elephants in the world today are Elephas maximus, the Asian elephant. As you know, the Mahabharata, as you know, the Bhagavad Gita, some of you know it very well. War elephants have been a part of India for thousands of years. And they're very trainable, the domestic Asian elephant. In fact, today you can find them, special saws made that trunks wrap around, they take down peak forests, 2 elephants at a time. Very domesticable Asian elephant. People have scoffed about the African elephant being domesticable. Well, that's Loxodendron africanus, but there are at least 3 or 4 subspecies. There are several different subspecies as well of Elephas maximus, Javanese as well as Indian, and so on and so on and so on. But there is the savanna elephant, and there's the bush elephant. There was also a now extinct Atlas Mountain Mauritanian elephant. It was smaller. Yeah, it leaves 3 subspecies of African elephants. But we know Hannibal had both. Now let's look at a little bit of the evidence. By the way, what do you see on these elephants right here? These are Asian elephants. Those are female, because Asian female adult do not have tusks. But African female adults do. And look at the difference. The rounded back of the Asian and the huge cerebrum. Notice the scalloped saddled back of the African, and a very different type of not so prominent cerebrum. You see rounded as opposed to very much parabolic, or very steep parabola on the Asian. Now if you look at the evidence, notice, we see here a what? Notice the big ears, big ears, small ears, tusks. It appears that this barked coin shows an African elephant. Do you see that very distinctly? Yeah. And yet, the elephant that Hannibal rode was called Suros, because Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic era brought a lot of Asian elephants back into Syria. The Seleucids used elephants a lot in the Maccabean Wars. So we have both Asian elephants and African elephants as a likelihood. If Hannibal's own personal elephant was the Syrian, that's an Asian elephant. And we have other data, ceramic data, a lot of data that shows in the Hellenistic era both types of elephants were used. Now we thought, historians and archaeologists thought, that African elephants couldn't be domesticated. And I did a lot of research with the Smithsonian, the San Diego Zoo, pachyderm vertebrate studies. Guess what? I still was biased against African elephants until a few years ago. Hollywood called me up and said, come down and make a movie on Hannibal. And I said, I really don't have time. But we talked it out, and I said, okay, especially when they said they had an elephant on the set. Her name was Susie. She was 25 years old. She was more intelligent than most of the crew. She was African. She ate up every tree in that canyon in LA, voraciously hungry. She knew over 100 commands. Wow. Smart as a, elephants really are amazing. She was wrinkled as anything could be at 25 years old, but she was African, was Susie. And they tried to get her to charge against dummies in this set, this Hollywood set. She wouldn't do it because they looked too human. She was trained to respect humans. It was really a problem. It took a whole day to get her to do anything that might be construed against anti-human. They took her huge, huge foot, this African elephant, they placed it on a dummy head, the plastic ones where red ink spurts out. And she was going, she was really resisting. She did not want to crush a human-like head. I think that poor elephant needed real elephant psychotherapy. But she was African, super smart, and so we rethought this issue. He probably had both African and Asian elephants in different subspecies. Now, quickly, what kind of guides did he take? Well, I can tell you, we've always hired the best guides over the Alps. Joël Blay, one of them. But the best guides over the Alps There you go, there's one of the best guys I've ever seen. Okay? They can track anything too, as you know. But what kind of guys do you take? Well, mostly Celts, because the Celts went back and forth across the Alps many times. And you know the tribe of the Boii there, that were from Bologna, they were the ones who had the most to lose to Roman incursions. So they were guides, but also Allobroge. He had some good guides from the Allobroge side on the fertile lower lands, and then Allobroge upper tribe who resisted him. These tribes resisted him somewhat. Some of the other tribes, the Taurini and others, eventually came over to him once he subdued them. But thinking of that, this is just one of the National Geographic textbooks where we work on this a lot in search of Hannibal's route, 25 years. But it's not just Hannibal's route over the Alps, it's all the way through Italy, Carthage, Spain, Turkey, etc. And there I'm looking at a geological map. And that's in a summit valley, where, by the way, at the bottom of this valley, here's a little scoop for you. The bottom of this valley in Italy, in the Valley of Susa, is a carbonized elephant tusk.
Oh.
On this valley floor, we have gathered lots of rib bones, and we're now doing the DNA. And at first to see what species, human or animal, and then if they're human, where the DNA is going to take us. So we've got some evidence, but I can't reveal that to everybody. I can reveal that to you, but it's not something I can put in print media yet. Yeah. Now, the Clapier route, as I said, the route that we think is the most direct, you get to the top of it, you look right down into Turin. On a clear day, you can see Turin. And by the way, with all these kids I've taken for years, here's one of our groups, and there are no roads. This is basically a footpath. I'm wearing the red coat in the back, meaning I'm the slowest, and I'm the oldest. And I tell these kids, don't get too far ahead, because you don't know where to turn. And every once in a while, they just get overeager, and they go off, and then we have to spend hours yodeling to get them to come down off the road, because they've taken the wrong turn. So it pays, because I set the pace. Now, look, here's a group of us, 34 Stanford athletes. That's usually the kind of student who comes with us, for athletes. So we've had a lot of water polo, football, gymnasts, crew, bicyclists. That's a Stanford team of 34 students. You can see some are pretty big. And that's his Pont d'Avignon. So we started at the Avignon, crossed the Rhone, went up north. It was really keen because that day it just so happened that our bicycle route took us through Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Not bad. But anyway, that's a different group. We've had groups, we separate them sometimes at a week at a time into 10. It's a lot easier to take 10 at a time than 34 at once. I think some of you may recognize that castle. Yes? If you know Liechtenstein, Gutenberg, Schloss Gutenberg, yes? But anyway, that's part of the route. This is a kind of, you look at these beautiful towns with wonderful cheese, by the way.
Wow.
Just incredible cheese. Now, that is the lake at the summit. That's Josh Nunes, Stanford University football quarterback. Now, some of you may be USC alumni here, but at Stanford, when Stanford beats USC, it's a big deal. Josh did as a quarterback. And one of my favorite students. That's his brother Justin, who was quarterback for the UC Davis Aggies. Two brothers, two quarterbacks. And one day we got stuck on a mountain because one of my other drivers decided to make a U-turn in the middle of the road and got stuck in the soft shoulder in the mud. And I thought, oh boy, no AAA, we're stuck, we're going to be here for 2 days. These two guys lifted the car out of the shoulder. You know, they're both 6'5", so that helped. 6'4", 6'5". Anyway, these are the kinds of kids, and they're both engineers, by the way. Like half the Stanford football team. Engineers, you probably knew that, right? Yeah. Now, that's a Roman road at the top of this pass. Can you see it right there?
Oh, wow.
Mostly covered under talus, or éboulis en français. And that Roman road is over an old Celtic road. Français, éboulis. Éboulis. Talus. So here, That's all that's left of that Roman road
Wow.
over an old Celtic path that we have dated both the Celtic path and the Roman path, including lichenometry, Rhizocarpum geographicum and Xanthoria elegans, and a lot of other stone weathering tools. So that's us now, looking at the Roman road. That's the terrace wall. That's Josh Nunes again, the quarterback. And we're measuring the lichen sizes here. We've had a publication about that recently as well. Maybe even listed in the bibliography book. That's the Summit Valley of the Clapier. It can easily camp 25,000 soldiers. It's a mile long and half a mile wide, and that lake has been there 3,000 years. We proved that recently. And it has turf and grass, rich foraging for elephants and for pack animals. Even if it's under a little bit of snow or ice, or if it's frosted, it's still there and easily digestible. You get much higher than 9,000 feet, forget it. There's nothing for animals to eat, and there's no water for them to drink. This is the only pass, I'm standing at the summit, this is the only pass in the Alps that you can camp at the summit. You see this camp right there. That's the summit. I'm looking west, back in France, that's looking the other way, another different year. There's always snow here. That's important because Polybius says that when Hannibal's men just started the descent, they broke through the fresh crust of snow into the ice from the previous winter. So there has to be permanent snow traces in Hannibal's Pass. And this is the only one I've been in. Even higher ones further south, like Col de la Traversée. I've never seen snow in August or July. We always have snow in July and August in this pass. So there are just so many concatenations of probabilities. Anyway, you know what happens if you get a bunch of college students together and you say, we're here, oh, look at this fresh snow. What happens to the leader? I get pelted with snowballs. All right. There's a different team. There's Turin. You can't see it, but it's right there. That's Turin. That's the Val di Susa. The elephant tusk is right there. And if you move a little bit further down the saddle, if you keep walking along the saddle for another 20 minutes, you can see perfectly up this valley of Turin right there.
Wow.
And that's part of the conditions too that Polybius says. He took his men, showed them the Po River Valley down below them. There it is. Now, this is a good case of size disparities. Joel Blay, our guide, because I bring a lot of Stanford football players for multiple reasons. George Halomodaris is 6'10", weighs over 300 pounds. When the Stanford football players, although I take gymnasts too, God, they're amazingly agile. But these football players, when they try to squeeze out of a van, Joel laughed first and said, Patrick, you brought les éléphants. There's one of our elephants, George. Another engineer, by the way. O-line engineer. The first time we went over this pass, it was in a blizzard. Joel, again, Blay, said, Patrick, you are nuts to go across the blizzard. And I said, this is my only day I can do it, Joel. And he said, but it's a blizzard. And I said, yeah, well, let's experience what Hannibal had to do. Well, I had to pay him trouble, but we went over in a blizzard, the Col de Clapier Sabine Coche in 1996. And the wind and the gale were just coming now. They're coming near the border. That's actually the border right there. It comes down here. And as we came through, it was 100 miles an hour.
Wow.
It literally shredded our clothes in gusts.
Wow.
And if you look closely, we're duct taped together.
Wow.
You see the duct tape on our knees and pants?
Oh.
It was really a blizzard. We hiked 25 miles that day from La Cannae near Bremen all the way down into Italy, way down to SS-25, down into the Val di Susa. Of course, I was a little younger in 1996. Anyway, sometimes it's so foggy up there you cannot see 10 feet. One particular day, we heard sheep go by. We didn't see them. Didn't see a sheep. We heard them, and then, of course, we saw where they'd been. But the fog lifted 10 feet. We were stopping for a little snack break. Big rocks suddenly come into sight. There's a big shadow on one of those rocks looming not too far from us, 10 feet away. And so the student said, oh, look at that big shaggy dog. That must be the sheepdog. It wasn't a sheepdog. There are wolves up there, as I said. So, the kids, I told them that at the end of the day, and they stayed real close together that day. One girl got so frightened, she took all our red and white caution tape, tiled a third of a mile long, our caution tape, and strung other students together with it. Anyway, it is challenging. We've dug over 30 sondages test pits. Look at how deep that soil is. That's a geologically stable place.
Yeah.
It has not been in glaciation in the past Holocene 10,000 plus years. This is pretty much what Hannibal would have camped at. And as I said, we've now found campground ash. Campground ash. Not a big pile of it in one spot, not over a long term, a very thin layer in lots of spots all over this valley. And the date is right. So, all right, different teams. One of my favorite persons in the world, Ed Bainig, who's been my assistant director for about 5 or 6 years. I worked at REI, got us great discounts. Now, did he have the right equipment and been across the Alps? No, but here's what the little heart says. Normal soldiers always prefer the known to the unknown. Hannibal is an abnormal general, and hence, like other great captains, chose to face the most hazardous conditions rather than the certainty of meeting as opposed to the position of their own choosing. He always chose his battle sites. Now, just quickly, what was the secret weapon then? Let me just quickly finish this up. There I am at the Trebia River, thanks to National Geographic. Here is where the Romans camped here near River Garo here on this side, on the west side, the east side of the river. The Carthaginians were on the west side. If you look at the next picture, this is in August, but here you can see right there that little valley. Hannibal hid 2,000 men with his brother Mago in that little valley right there.
Wow.
And he sent his Numidian cavalry on the winter solstice to taunt the hot-headed, impetuous, overconfident, wannabe political appointee commander, Sempronius. Taunted him. The Numidian cavalry came over a shallow place on the winter solstice, but when they went back, they taunted him and said all kinds of things. The Roman political appointee, because the Romans alternated political appointee with military veteran every other day, Hannibal always exploited that. The military appointee, political general Sempronius, took the taunt seriously, got his men out of camp before breakfast, no breakfast, and chased the Numidian cavalry, who went along the river taunting them, and then stopped at the deepest spot where the Romans crossed, in the ice. And when they came out of that river, the Romans' clothes froze on them. And Hannibal swept down upon them, totally sluggish and hardly able to move. Annihilated 15,000 of them. The Roman general fled. And whatever survivors weren't captured were trampled by the war elephants. Hannibal used this winter solstice, freezing conditions at Trebia, to obliterate the Romans, the environment. Winter. Usually you don't fight in winter in antiquity. Hannibal did, and taunted the Romans, and they fell in the trap. Tricky guy. That's just some of the different types of pictures you can find for this battle. Rome was so frightened by it, they worried about Hannibal at the gates. Hannibal at the gates. Was he coming for them? But the Roman general said his defeat, he said, was totally the weather, not Hannibal. They kind of believed it. And then Hannibal, and I talk about all this in the book, then Hannibal trapped them at Lake Trasimene. He went up a little valley, and by the way, there's a little stream that flows through here today called Sanguinetto. Bloody stream. Because Hannibal trapped the Romans in this little valley, and think of San Francisco, hot air means cold air. Lake Trasimene was covered in fog. Hannibal hid his men in all the valleys. Here they are. The Romans see him disappear in this valley at nightfall, at sunset. He disappears, they camp outside, he camps here. But he sets up in the night all these ambushes, and in the fog in the morning, the Romans fall right into the trap. And what Romans survived are taken captive, 15 to 20,000 again killed, forced into the mud, into the river, into the swamps. And Hannibal again claimed an incredible strategic victory with probably 30,000 Roman deaths or captives. Now Rome had to think about it. What are they going to do? For the next few years, Fabius Maximus, the delayer, says, don't engage, don't engage. Let the war of attrition nibble his heels. Then Hannibal went down to the Volturnus Valley near Naples, and he was raiding all the rich Roman farms and taking cattle. And Fabius Maximus thought he had, the Roman in general, thought he had Hannibal trapped in this valley. So what did Hannibal do? Took 3,000 cattle that night, some say 2,000, got a lot of firewood, tied the wood between the horns of the cattle, put his men to bed early, and at Trebia, he greased his men with pig fat in the cold. This time, he put his bed to bed early, and then at 2 o'clock in the morning, he lit the fires in the horn, between the horns of his cattle, sent them up this way. The Romans thought Hannibal was trying to escape over that way, with all these, what they thought were torches in the night. So they abandoned their guard positions in this little pass. The Romans went this way, Hannibal went right over the pass and escaped. So, tricky guy. Now, they didn't engage him for another year and a half, and then they brought 8 legions together at Cannae. Hannibal took Canusium, the grain depot at Canusium, which the Romans needed too. He took it to supply his armies in Puglia today. By the way, that Roman general, same kind of hothead, same kind of impetuous, overconfident. He was decapitated. The Celts took his trophy head, as the Celts were wont to do. Now, again, Cannae. What Hannibal did at Cannae, he took the grain supply at Cannae, Canusium, and then he chose his position. And if you've ever been in the Mediterranean, one of these dust storms, they're terrible. They pit even windshields. You have to be so careful. And Hannibal lined up facing north and made the Romans face south into this dust wind, blinding them with sand and dust in their eyes. Some say that he poisoned the water spots. He got there first and dumped carcasses of animals in all those spots, except the ones where his army was. So the Romans couldn't have access to good water. That's the Cannae. And by the way, it's today a huge, huge viticultural area. There's a famous column there. And Plutarch says Fabius, the delayer, told the military commander to basically restrain the political appointee Terentius. This alternating system, well, that's what Cannae looks like today. Hannibal forced the Romans between the Alpidus River, today called the Ofanto, and these hills. So 80,000 men constrained in this small area. This is where Hannibal's famous double envelopment took place, because the Romans couldn't outflank him. The Romans outnumbered Hannibal 2 to 1, but couldn't outflank because of the hills and the river. And what Hannibal did there, first he had a false maneuver. He sent his army forward, and the Balearic Islanders, who were slingers, took down Aemilius Paulus, the military commander, with slings, with slingshots. He was incapacitated, and then Hannibal had his Africans and Spaniards in these sides, and their armor was taken from 2 previous defeats of Romans, so they looked just like Romans. And Hannibal stepped forth and he backed up his great cavalry here. The Roman cavalry fled on both sides, decimated by the Hannibalic cavalry. And after they fled, and here Terentius Varro literally fled the battle, just like Sempronius had at Trebia. And then Hannibal's cavalry came back and boxed them in. And remember, they're compressed so tight, this picture doesn't show it, they're compressed so tight in this little valley, at least 70,000 Romans, that only the outside of the box can actually fight. So the inside is useless. And Hannibal's men surrounded the outside, the cavalry, the Africans, and they had these deadly falcata blades. We made some, and again in LA, great weapons maker named Dave Baker made some of these amazing swords called falcata. They're front-loaded, center of gravity, amazing swords. This is Victor Davis Hansen, who says a brave mass of 70,000 brave souls was encircled in a small plain. He says that Hannibal's army was poorly organized and brutally led. I'm not so sure they were poorly organized, but they were definitely multicultural. And you can imagine battle cacophony with 6 languages being spoken on Hannibal's side. How are you going to give direction? Probably trumpet peals. And he did organize. They knew exactly when to move. When to the 2 flanks of Hannibal's men, in the blinding dust of the Romans' eyes couldn't see. They were walking literally into a trap with these 2 lines on either side. And a trumpet peal, those Africans and Spanish just suddenly turned 90 degrees and faced inward and started to march to take down the Romans. And this is where Hannibal really understood what we can call literally the psychological effects of war. Hannibal knew that fear would take over. The Romans were mostly young recruits. He understood. In fact, I think Hannibal did not have much post-traumatic syndrome in his army because he taught his men the brutality of war. It was the Romans who, that pit of fear in their stomachs took over the country. At least 55,000 Romans died that day. That's what those falcata blades look like. And as I said, the center of gravity is right there. Gravity, when you pull it, we've literally used some of these weapons, new-made weapons, on formaldehyde pickled fetal pigs, like rubber, and yet these blades just easily maimed Romans, chopping off arms and legs. You can just imagine the fear that took over. What you call basically the psyops of war. Hannibal was well schooled in the psyops of war. I know it sounds grisly. That's what before Cannae, and that's after.
Wow.
South Italy went over to Hannibal.
Wow.
Now Hannibal didn't ultimately win. The war of attrition was against him as an invader. Carthage didn't supply him, and one very vital fact. I always say that all history is also economic history. And Scipio, whom he trained as his Roman enemy, went over and took the silver supplies of Spain. Once Hannibal was cut off from silver, he could no longer afford good military intel, and he couldn't pay his mercenaries. That 12 years of hanging around, waiting for Carthage to resupply him, which they didn't. Ultimately, Hannibal's veterans became older and older. The Celts said, we're going back home, no more loot, because now we're in Allied territory and we can't rob and loot. And how are you going to pay them without Spanish silver? And eventually Scipio said, Rome, let me go to Carthage. And he did. Finally, Carthage recalled Hannibal. And everything had turned around. All the Numidians were now bribed to be on the Roman side. Carthage only supplied Hannibal with recruits, raw and untrained war elephants. It was a disaster, but Hannibal knew it. Now, this is just something about Cannae. At Cannae, 1 out of every 5 Roman adult males was butchered that day. 30,000 gallons of blood. More people died on that day at Cannae than any other time in history on a battlefield. Those are givens. And Hannibal's men collected 200 rings of Roman knights. That day at Cannae, 29 out of 80 tribunes of Rome died. 25 Roman senators died.
Wow.
Most of the Roman generals died.
Wow.
And Maharbal, his Numidian cavalry commander, said, Hannibal, let's go march on Rome. Hannibal said, I don't think so. Our men are exhausted. We have wounded and dead too. It will take us at least a week to get there. And Rome is surrounded by a burned wall 50 miles around with all the Tiber water they need. It's not an easy deal. And Maharbal said, Hannibal, you know how to win victories, but not how to use them. Well, Hannibal knew that Rome was probably not easy takings. History will always ask that question. Why did Hannibal not march on Rome? Well, there are a lot of questions we could ask, and you've been very patient. But, as I mentioned, Hannibal's tactics, his brilliant tactics, outthinking, outwitting, use of really good military intel. He got into the minds of his enemies. You know Machiavelli's The Prince, yes? When you go ahead and reread books 17 and 18, guess who figures prominently in Machiavelli's The Prince? Machiavelli's talking about Hannibal, especially when he says that it's better to be feared than loved. Hannibal may have been scary. Hannibal at the gates was what the Romans used for centuries after to scare up patriotism amongst their people. Hannibal at the gates. Hannibal at the gates. Hannibal was a bogeyman to Rome. And ultimately, as you know how his life ended, the Romans chased him from place to place to place. Scipio probably alerted him, even in Carthage, to get away. Scipio actually admired him. They met twice at least. Hannibal said to Scipio before the Battle of Zama in 202, "What I was 20 years ago, you are today. And what you are today, I was 20 years ago." They met again in Ephesus. Hannibal was a mercenary in Crete, a mercenary when he went into exile from Carthage. Scipio probably set him up to be the great judge, the sufet at Carthage, to get war penalties paid. Hannibal was a good organizer. But the Carthaginian Drusi did not like Hannibal. He was going to be taken to Roman chains. He fled. He went to Crete. He went back to basically to Phoenicia. He went all the way back to the mother city of Tyre. Then he became a mercenary for the Macedonians. He became a mercenary for the Bithynians. He fought against other Roman allies, the Eumenides, the Attila dynasty of Turkey, if you know Pergamon today. They came at him with their vast, more superior navy. Hannibal may have started biological warfare because what he did that day, he gathered all these vipers in baskets on the forehead. And when the Pergamines came and grappled with his ships, he threw all the snakes overboard. And the Pergamines fled. That's the kind of tactician he was. But now, in 182 BC, he's in his 60s. He knows the Bithynians aren't happy with him. The king, to whom he's a mercenary, he's worried about whether he's actually going to betray him. And sure enough, the last night of his life, Hannibal is in his fortress at Libissa, near Getza on the Sea of Marmora. And suddenly he notices all his staff has fled in his fortress. There's only one loyal aide-de-camp. And Hannibal says to this man, where did we go? Go check. We have one main door and about 7 secret hideout exits. Go check them all. The aide-de-camp came back with bad news each time. Sir, there's a Roman soldier waiting at every secret exit. Hannibal took poison that night. He was not going to go back in humiliation, in chains, to Rome. It's a real enigma of a story. I don't tell it so well tonight as I do in the book. But I will tell you that we're stirring up a bit of controversy with this book. Not all my academic colleagues are happy because it's a territorial turf war, as you can imagine. But we're very, very fortunate. And I must say I'm humbled to be able to try to tell this story new. With bright people like you, and I'm not giving you much time for questions, I know, but I will say we've had some wonderful reviews in the Christian Science Monitor who said that it was basically an engrossing read, and Kirkus Reviews gave us a rave star review, which was not easy, and said it was a thrilling page-turner. Well, I think, really, it's not me. Trust me, it's Hannibal. It's the story. I'm just a banker who knows where it's read. The story is a great story, and I'm very fortunate and humbled to try to tell it anew. Thank you. Are we have time for a few questions?
Yes.
Please, sir.
Are there primary sources?
Yes.
From Carthage?
Libya, from Carthage.